New York, 1911. Steam rises off the streets as a boy named Gaetano Tommy Lucchese limps toward a life of quiet power. Decades later, another figure emerges, Aniello Dellacroce, the silent confessor of the underworld. Different men, different eras, but bound by the same code: discipline, loyalty, and the belief that true power never needs to be loud. As the story begins, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. If you enjoy the story, like the video and subscribe to support the channel. February 1951 made Manhattan smell of coal and wet wool. I reached the brownstone 2 days early, hat dripping and patience thin. A Western Union boy waited on the stoop, stamping warmth into his shoes. He checked his slip, blinked, and decided I would do for Mr. Wolf. The yellow envelope bore Wolf's name in brave block capitals. I let myself in with my key. Our door keeps its dignity. The vestibule offered stock from the kitchen, orchids, and the city's soot. Fritz called a greeting and stayed where he belonged, beyond the door. The office sat quiet under lamplight, blinds down against the damp. Wolf's yellow leather looked patient, which was his chair's best trick. He would be among the orchids until 6, and that was scripture. I used the brass knife and opened the envelope cleanly. Claudia Armitage. Stop. Park Avenue. Stop. Request. Interview tonight. Regarding estate. Stop. Grave urgency. Stop. Retainer satisfactory. Stop. Please confirm by telephone before 7. Stop. The capitals pushed, but the tone remained cold and controlled. A timestamp at 9 told me when it began its journey. At the margin, someone had added a line that was careless. Before your assistant returns, Friday, stop. I held it to the lamp and read everything twice for comfort. Wednesday was my day, not Friday, thanks to a cancelled assignment. Whoever wrote that had a timetable set to someone else's watch. I drew the telephone close and asked for the Park Avenue number. A maid answered in the proper refined tone for a refined widow. I announced myself and asked for Claudia Armitage, businesslike and polite. The line clicked, then a voice arrived, crisp as new stationery. Mrs. Armitage, I said. Archie Goodwin for Mr. Wolf. Mr. Goodwin, she said. Is Mr. Wolf available for a conference tonight? He's available after dinner, I said. He might hear you at 8:30. If he will receive me, she said, I will bring relevant documents. What kind of documents? I asked. And how urgent is urgent? My late husband's estate requires immediate attention, she said. I prefer your house because it protects conversation and reputation. We try to keep both safe, I said. Tell me about retainer. 1,000 now, cashier's check, she said, even and clear. Expenses to follow, as needed, subject to reasonable itemizing. The radiator gave one hiss, and my eyebrows made their travel. That will secure attention, I said. 8:30 will be acceptable. Please expect me alone, she said. I must avoid any notice tonight. We exchanged address and exchange, then ended with the usual courtesies. I placed the receiver back, and the office resumed its regard. The telegram waited on the blotter, the ink still looking recent. I wrote her particulars in the book, which spares quarrels later. Then I pressed the buzzer to the plant rooms, sins and all. The exchange name chimed like silver spoons, neat and expensive. I noted it because Wolf prefers such shorthand when passing people. I checked the filing time again, since ink can flatter lies. 9 in the morning leaves hours for plans to breathe and wander. Someone believed those hours would pass with me elsewhere, comfortably absent. That pebble stayed in my shoe, however fine the leather. It is not done before 6, yet phone calls earn exceptions. Yes, Wolf said, which is a conversation if you know him. Telegram, I said. Claudia Armitage, Park Avenue. Urgent estate business tonight. Silence took a pause, then returned to work on my ears. The orchids keep me until 6, he said. Dinner holds me until 7. Afterward, I might endure interruption, given compensation and cents. 1,000 at once by check, I said. Documents promised. Fui, he said, without vinegar, which meant he had consented. 8:30, I said. She wishes to avoid attention and arrives alone. Arrange the red chair nearest the door, he said. Align it exactly. Some people sit straighter when the room acknowledges straightness. And increase the heat. Damp encourages whining. Your campaign against whining enjoys my support, I said, and rang off. Fritz arrived at the threshold with a tray and that solemn gait. He placed a glass on the table and announced lamb for dinner. Rain argues for lamb with rosemary, and Fritz never loses that argument. I thanked him and kept my hands civilized around the beer. The blinds came down another fraction while I watched the street. A sedan waited opposite, hood steaming, driver half drowned in smoke. He wrote in a small book and counted traffic like an usher. He might have been waiting for anyone. I disliked that coincidence. I turned back to the telegram and the ridiculous margin line. Friday had been written as if I were a calendar decoration. My early return had cancelled somebody else's arithmetic. At 6, Wolf came down the stairs, the plant rooms trailing warmth. He entered as if gravity preferred him, then made the chair agree. He drank and held out a hand, and I handed the paper. "The 1,000 is a door," he said. "It is not a hallway." "She will bring documents," I said. "She values discretion and speed." "People who value speed often detest accuracy," he said. He read again and tapped the margin with one forefinger. "She miscounted your days," he said, "or wished others to miscount them." "The boy delivered it to me on the stoop," I said. "That does not comfort me," he said. "Assumptions rarely do." "We will not credit that line until it earns the courtesy. Meanwhile, the room will be exact." He dictated the diary entry, brief and complete, as he prefers. Name, address, time, and money, each accorded one tidy line. "Her voice," he said. "Provide contour." "Educated," I said. "Grief taught it breath control." "Fear sits in the outer room, but it keeps its hat on." He grunted, which is a compliment that refuses to lower itself. "Examine the rug," he said, "and prepare the ashtrays. The damp will not borrow recruits here tonight." I did as ordered, and the house made its small music. The radiator agreed to behave, and the blinds found true lines. 2 fresh pencils lay by the blotter, sharp but not hostile. At 7, the bell announced dinner, with confidence that required no reply. We ate without talk because the lamb did all necessary talking. Coffee followed, and coherence returned like a friend with a coat. Wolf moved back to his chair with that private inevitability. Outside, a bus sighed by with faces pressed to misted glass. The block listened the way moneyed blocks listen, carefully and close. Our routines joined that quiet, which suits a house that sells discretion. Upstairs, the orchids kept their steady secrets about time and temper. The lamps were islands on the desk, and the air was comfortable. I drew the forward red chair to its line and tested balance. The telegram rested under the paperweight like a clerk at closing. The sedan across the street had gone, or chosen discretion. Handkerchiefs stood ready, because comfort is not a small influence. I checked the lock and set the chain, the habit that earns salary. Our door does not indulge casual entries. The house has opinions. 8:15 showed on the mantel clock, a time that flatters callers. Rain wrote slow strokes on the window, elegant as a stubborn tutor. Wolf shut his eyes for a moment, but was not sleep. "Your early return," he said, "injures someone's planning already." "I enjoy my talent for offense," I said. "Do not mistake luck for talent," he said. "We will test them." "I saw a driver making notes," I said, "across the way." "Your observation is recorded," he said, and allowed one dry noise. We waited, as professionals wait, with patience made of routine. Waiting can be dull or surgical, depending on what may arrive. The house arranged itself like a jury waiting for counsel. I considered polishing my shoes, then decided restraint would look truer. Wolf allowed no clutter that didn't help a conversation breathe. The bell rang at 28 past, and I stood by the chain. Wolf nodded once, which is as loud as his approvals come. I opened the inner door and let the rain give its statement. Footsteps approached with the confidence of heels that know parquet. A hat brim lifted in the glass to measure our hospitality. I slipped the chain and opened, and the city leaned into the vestibule. Behind me, the yellow leather prepared itself for a client and a price. I saw only a gloved hand on the button and a travelling drop. Her face would come in due form after the introductions and gate. The telegram in my pocket kept her voice alive and demanding, and my early return had already bent someone else's page. The brass hands on the mantel clock had just touched 7 when the bell rang, not a second early or late. I crossed the office, checked the vestibule through the glass, and found a woman framed by the frosted panel. The overcoat was sable, the hat small enough to show dark hair swept back from a pale, composed face. Her eyes, clear, unhurried, took my measure before I opened the inner door. "Mrs. Claudia Armitage?" I asked. "Yes, Mr. Goodwin." Her voice was the kind that didn't need to raise itself. I stepped aside, and she entered with the kind of economy that avoids wasted motion. A trace of February damp clung to the fur. The coal smoke from the street followed it in. I relieved her of the coat and hat, hung them in the foyer closet, and led her into the office. The lamps were already lit, making the reds in the client chairs look richer against the dark wood. Wolf sat in the yellow leather, facing the desk like a magistrate with all day to consider a case. He inclined his head as I made the introduction, then indicated the nearer red chair with a forefinger. "Mrs. Armitage," he said. She seated herself without fuss, clasping a small black handbag in her lap. I took my chair to the side, notebook ready. "My husband, Henry Armitage, died last October," she began. "His will left the bulk of his estate to me, with several specific bequests. Among them, a parcel of waterfront property in Red Hook was to pass to my stepdaughter Eleanor. At least, that was my understanding until 2 weeks ago." Her hands remained steady on the bag, but her eyes stayed on Wolf. "A codicil has appeared," she continued. "Dated in September, bearing my husband's signature, transferring that property to a man named Gilbert Renwick. I have every reason to believe it is a forgery." Wolf rested his fingertips together. "Reason? Because my husband detested Mr. Renwick," she said evenly. "He considered him unscrupulous in business and disreputable in private conduct. And because Henry never mentioned this codicil to me, though he discussed all other estate matters in detail." Wolf made a low noise. "And your interest?" "Property is valuable. More importantly, if the codicil is allowed to stand, my stepdaughter will contest the will. That contest will not be confined to the courtroom. She knows things about the family, about me, that would be unpleasant in the newspapers. I want the codicil discredited before she has cause." I watched Wolf's eyes narrow slightly, his version of a raised eyebrow. "You have the document?" "A notarized copy," she said. "The original is in Mr. Renwick's possession. He claims to be safeguarding it until probate." She opened the handbag and withdrew a folded sheet inside a legal-sized envelope. The paper was cream, the notary's seal impressed in the lower corner. She placed it on the desk without leaning forward. "And this," she said, removing a second envelope, "is a letter from Henry to me, dated a week before his death. It contains his signature, his real signature, for comparison." I rose, took both envelopes to Wolf, and resumed my seat. He drew the copy out first, adjusting his glasses. The signature sprawled across the page, bold and deliberate. The notary's statement followed in a neat, upright hand. Wolf studied the letter next. It was brief, a note about a charity dinner they had attended, signed in the same large, confident script. He compared them without comment, and set both on the blotter. "This letter," he said. "When did you receive it?" "The day after it was written," she replied. "And the codicil, when did you first see it?" Her eyes held his, a fraction too long. "When Mr. Renwick's solicitor presented it to my attorney, 12 days ago." "Not before?" "No." She smoothed the edge of the bag with her thumb. "I told you, Henry never mentioned it." Wolf's gaze lingered and dropped to the papers. "You will leave these with me?" "Yes." He leaned back, settling into the leather. "Forgery is not presumed, it is proved. It will require access to the original codicil and to Mr. Renwick." "I can arrange a meeting," she said. "Arrange nothing," he said curtly. "Mr. Goodwin will call on him. He will remain apart from any inquiry until I advise otherwise." Her chin lifted a degree. "If you think I will be idle—" "I think," Wolf interrupted, "that if you interfere, you may damage the result you desire. I am not inclined to accept employment only to have it sabotaged by the client." Silence held for a moment, and she inclined her head. "Very well." "The fee," Wolf said, "is $200 a day plus expenses. I am prepared to pay it." She reached into the handbag again and placed an envelope thick with bills on the desk. Wolf made no move to touch it. I took it instead and counted without flourish. "Mr. Goodwin will give you a receipt," he said. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and met his eyes. "You will keep this confidential?" "To the extent possible, but I will not sacrifice the case to secrecy." "I understand." She turned to me. "Mr. Goodwin, you'll see me out?" In the vestibule, I helped her into the sable and set the hat just so, She fastened the coat at the throat, the fur framing her face like an old portrait. "Your employer is a difficult man," she said. "I've heard that. I'll expect results." I opened the outer door. The damp air met us, carrying the faint tang of coal from a chimney nearby. A hired car waited at the curb. The driver stepped out to open the rear door. She offered me the faintest nod, then was gone. When I returned, Wolf was still looking at the codicil copy, his mouth a straight line. "Well?" I asked. "She evaded," he said. "About what?" "The day she found the codicil," he said. "She spoke of when it was shown to her, not when she first knew of it." I sat, opened the notebook, and made the entry. "Claudia Armitage, widow of Henry, alleges forgery of codicil, transferring Red Hook property to Gilbert Renwick. Produces notarized copy of codicil, letter from husband dated week before death. Fee agreed. Client evasive on timing of discovery." Wolf pushed the papers toward me. "Secure them, and bring beer." I filed the documents, locked the drawer, and went to the kitchen. The aroma of Fritz's roast chicken drifted in, promising dinner within the hour. I poured the beer and brought it back. Wolf took the glass, drank, and closed his eyes. "Fui," he said softly, and let the glass rest on the arm of the chair. I knew that tone. The case had already begun. ChatGPT said, "Under a dry February sky, I left the brownstone with Wolf's instructions snug in my pocket, and a mental note to keep my own temper under wraps. Madison Avenue was a brisk corridor of tailored overcoats and purposeful heels, the sidewalks reflecting a pale winter sun of patches of frozen slush. Renwick's building was a 12-story limestone block with brass-trimmed doors and a doorman who took my name without asking questions. He waved me toward an elevator lined in walnut veneer, the kind that made you feel underdressed even if you weren't. The ride up was smooth and silent. I stepped out onto a carpeted hall where the air carried a faint hint of beeswax and older money. A discreet plaque read, "Gilbert Renwick, Development and Holdings." I opened the glass door into a reception area that was small, warm, and carefully lit, the kind of place where a handshake might be as binding as a contract. The receptionist, a brunette with steel-framed spectacles and a voice like polished marble, looked up from a ledger. "Mr. Goodwin?" she asked. "That's me. Mr. Renwick is expecting you." She led me through to an inner office, and the change in air was immediate. The scent of expensive pipe tobacco lingered, sweet and woody, the sort you'd expect to find curling from a leather chair in a gentleman's club. Renwick stood behind a broad mahogany desk, his suit a shade between charcoal and midnight, his tie a discreet silk. The polish in his manner was matched by the gleam in his eyes, not warmth exactly, but an alertness honed by years of turning property into profit. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, extending a hand with deliberate pressure. "Do sit down." The chair opposite him was deep, the leather cool to the touch. I settled in, noting the desk's uncluttered surface. A blotter, a crystal ashtray, a pen stand, and a single framed photograph. The photograph caught my attention. Renwick standing between two men, all three in evening dress, their smiles fixed in that way which suggests they had just closed something lucrative. I recognized Charles Duval, a banker whose name had come up in more than one headline about shrewd deals, and Peter Lanford, an attorney with a reputation for making inconvenient documents disappear. Renwick followed my gaze. "Old friends," he said, "though I wouldn't call them part of this matter." "That matter being the codicil to Henry Armitage's will," I said. He leaned back, folding his hands. "A legitimate document, signed and witnessed. Mrs. Armitage is understandably unsettled, but her sentiment does not alter its authenticity." "I'd like to see the original," I said. His brows lifted a fraction. "Impossible, I'm afraid. Pending probate, it remains in my custody, and the court will not look kindly on any suggestion of impropriety." "Some might say refusing inspection invites the suggestion," I said. "Some might," he allowed, "but they would be mistaken. I am under no obligation to satisfy private curiosity." I let the pause breathe, listening to the faint hum of the building's heating system. "Then perhaps the copy I've seen will suffice for now, though the ink on it is remarkably fresh for something signed months ago." Renwick's eyes held mine, unblinking. "Perhaps your eye for stationery is keener than mine. I assure you, the document is precisely as it should be." The scent of pipe tobacco seemed stronger now, or perhaps it was the awareness that I was getting nothing more from him without a crowbar. He reached for the pen stand, adjusted it by a hair's breadth, and set his hands flat on the desk. "Mr. Goodwin, I must return to my work. Convey my regards to Mr. Wolfe, and tell him the matter will be resolved in due course, by the court, not by your employer's methods." I rose, taking in the photograph once more, the smooth grain of the mahogany, the subtle shine on Renwick's cufflinks. "Pleasure meeting you," I said. He gave a short nod. "Likewise." The receptionist saw me out, her shoes silent on the thick carpet. Back on the street, the cold air cleared the tobacco from my head, but not the impression that Renwick's office had been arranged with the precision of a stage set, and that somewhere in the wings, Duval and Lanford were waiting for their cues. ChatGPT said, "The bell rang at precisely 9:20, a single, decisive peal that echoed down the hallway. I was at my desk in the office, reviewing my notes from the Renwick visit, when Fritz appeared in the doorway. He didn't say a word, just tilted his head toward the front, his expression that of a man bringing in an unexpected course at dinner. I rose and crossed to the door, expecting perhaps a messenger. Instead, when I pulled it open, Inspector Kramer stood on the stoop, his overcoat collar turned up against the cold, hat low over his brow, and a dusting of snow melting on the shoulders. The set of his jaw promised no small talk. "Goodwin," he said, "I need to see Wolfe. Now." I stepped back to let him in, shutting the door behind him. "You've picked a delicate time. He's digesting corned beef and probably plotting my murder for letting you in at all." "Save the quips," Kramer said, shrugging out of his coat. "This isn't a social call. Renwick's dead." That took a half-second to register. "Dead?" "Shot. In his study. Time of death about 8:15. Less than an hour after you saw him." I led him into the office, where Wolfe sat in the yellow chair, fingers steepled over his middle, eyes narrowed at the intrusion. The lamplight pooled across the desk, catching the brass edge of the blotter. The room was warm, but the weight in Kramer's voice brought a draft of its own. "Inspector," Wolfe said, "your visits are rarely welcome, but tonight they are especially so. What occasion precipitates this breach of my evening?" "Renwick's been murdered," Kramer repeated, standing squarely in front of the desk. "Shot once through the chest, and a neighbor swears he saw a woman matching Claudia's description leaving the building minutes before." Wolfe's brows lifted a fraction. "You mean Mrs. Armitage?" "That's right. I want to talk to her. Tonight." "She is under my roof," Wolfe said evenly, "and she will remain so until counsel is present. You may leave your questions with me, but you will not question her here." Kramer's jaw worked. "Don't push me, Wolfe. I can get a warrant." "You may," Wolfe replied. "It will gain you nothing but the satisfaction of your own obstinacy. My obligation is to my client, and that includes protecting her from injudicious interrogation." I moved to the globe stand, poured a measure of rye into a glass, and brought it to Wolfe, who ignored it. Kramer's eyes followed me, irritation flickering. "She was seen leaving Renwick's place right before the shot was heard," he said. "That's not supposition, it's a sworn statement." "From a neighbor who recognized a silhouette in winter gloom," Wolfe said. "Not precisely the cornerstone of conviction." "It's enough to make her a person of interest," Kramer shot back. "Where was she between 8 and 8:30? "In this house," Wolfe said. "In the front room, with Mr. Goodwin. Archie?" I nodded. "She came in at 7:50, stayed until 8:15, then went upstairs to her room. Unless she's mastered by location, she couldn't have been on East 61st Street at 8:15. Kramer's gaze hardened. "We'll see what the medical examiner says about the time of death." "You will," Wolfe said. "And so will I. That time, Inspector, will prove decisive." For a moment, only the ticking of the wall clock intruded. Outside, a gust rattled the bare branches against the window pane. Kramer took a slow breath, retrieved his coat from the rack, and jammed his arms into it. "I'll be back," he said, "and if I find she lied about her movements, you will inform me," Wolfe finished. "Good evening, Inspector." Kramer left without another word. The door closed, Fritz's footsteps retreating toward the kitchen. Wolfe reached for the glass I'd set down, took a measured sip, and let out a faint sigh. "The exact time, Archie," he murmured, "is everything." I went to the desk, picked up my notebook, and sat. Wolfe's eyes had that distant focus I knew well, already arranging the pieces on the board. Somewhere between 8:15 and the bullet, the truth waited. and until we found it, the snow outside was warmer than what lay ahead. Under Wolf's orders, I headed for Duval's club first. The place sat on the upper floor of a narrow building off Madison, a kind of address that didn't bother with signage because the right people already knew it. Inside, a haze of cigarette smoke curled under the pressed tin ceiling. Somewhere beyond the mahogany bar, a muted jazz trio worked through body and soul, the saxophone weaving low and lazy. Glasses clinked, waiters slid between tables with the soft shuffle of well-trained shoes, and the lighting kept every face 3 parts shadow. Duval was at a corner banquette, a silk hat on the seat beside him, his dinner jacket a little too perfect for coincidence. "Goodwin," he said, with the kind of smile that had no warmth behind it. "Wolf sent you to pry, I take it?" "Pry's a harsh word," I said, sliding into the seat opposite. "Let's say, collect the facts while the trail's still warm." He waved a hand for the waiter. "Scotch for him." Turning back to me, he leaned in. "You've heard, I suppose, about Renwick." "I was there earlier," I said. "You were where?" "At a private dinner club, 6 of us. We didn't break until nearly 11. He smoothed his cuff. "That should be easy enough to confirm. I imagine you'll be checking." "I imagine," I said. "You knew about the codicil." "Renwick told me last week. He was in an expansive mood. I thought it odd. He'd never been generous for generosity's sake. Odd enough to mention it to anyone else." A glimmer of irritation crossed his face. "No, and I had no reason to wish him harm. His arrangements, codicil or no, didn't touch me." We let the waiter set down my drink. I took a sip. The scotch was decent. "Funny thing," I said. "Lanford says Renwick mentioned it months ago." Duval's brows rose. "Months? That's impossible. Either he misremembers, or he's trying to embroider the truth." I filed the reaction. When the bill came, he signed it with a flourish, retrieved his hat, and walked me to the street door. The winter air felt sharper after the muffled heat inside. Lanford's apartment was uptown, in a respectable brick building, with a uniformed doorman who gave me a look that said he didn't encourage uninvited visitors. Mrs. Lanford answered the door, a tall, poised woman in a navy house dress, eyes sharp behind gold-rimmed spectacles. She led me to the sitting room, where Lanford stood by the fireplace, pipe in hand. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, as though we'd met before, and the pleasure was entirely his. "I gather you're here about poor Renwick." "That's right. Where were you last night between 8 and 9? "At home, with my wife," he said smoothly. "We'd just finished supper. I was reading in my study." Mrs. Lanford nodded once, as if to certify the statement. "You knew about the codicil?" I asked. "Yes. Renwick mentioned it. Oh, back in September, I think. We were discussing some old ventures. He was proud of his planning." "That's months earlier than Duval says." A faint shrug. And Duval wasn't as close as he thought. Renwick trusted me with more than most. He tamped the bowl of his pipe, gaze sliding toward the window. Claudia would know, of course. She and Renwick were once business partners. That one landed. Claudia had omitted that little nugget when she spoke to Wolf. I kept my face still, only noting the crackle from the fire and the faint scent of cherry tobacco. "Business partners," I repeated. "Yes," he said mildly. "A brief arrangement, years ago. She may not speak of it, but it was no secret to those who were around at the time." The room seemed warmer now. I thanked him, took my leave, and stepped back into the cold street, turning the fact over. Wolf would want that piece on the board at once. The rain had slackened to a mist by the time the cab deposited Milton Greaves at the curb in front of the brownstone. The lamps along 35th Street glowed soft in the fog, throwing halos around themselves like ghostly wreaths. I'd been at the window in the office, watching for him, because Wolf had decreed that he didn't want the doorbell ringing twice before Fritz got there. I went down myself, sparing Fritz the trouble. The bell came once, a discreet chime, and I opened the door to a man in a dark overcoat buttoned to the throat, his hat brim damp with drizzle. Greaves was a trim figure, with a neat grey moustache and eyes the colour of tarnished silver. He carried a flat leather case under one arm, the kind you might mistake for a portable chess set. "Mr. Greaves?" I said. "Yes, good evening." His voice was low, precise, with the trace of a Cambridge finish. "Come in." I stepped back, taking his coat and hat once the door was shut. "Mr. Wolf's expecting you." Upstairs, The office was warm with the glow from the desk lamp and the steady hiss of the radiator. Wolf sat in the yellow chair, body settled deep, fingers resting on the arms like a man enthroned. The red leather client chair opposite was vacant, waiting for Greaves. On Wolf's desk, under a blotter, lay the codicil copy and the letter from Claudia's late husband. "Mr. Greaves," Wolf said as I ushered him in. "Be seated. You know why you're here?" Greaves inclined his head. "Your note mentioned an examination of handwriting. You've something for me to look at?" I fetched the documents from the desk, setting them side by side on a clean pad. Greaves opened his case, producing a jeweler's loupe, a slim brass ruler, and a magnifier with a circular light built in. He arranged them like a surgeon laying out instruments. Wolf gestured. "Archie will remain to observe. Proceed as you require." Greaves didn't waste time. He lifted the codicil first, holding it under the magnifier's halo. The lamplight caught the faint texture of the paper. His eyes narrowed. The loupe came into play. He traced the signature slowly with his gaze, not his finger. "Interesting," he murmured after a moment. Wolf made no sound. I leaned on the edge of my desk, hands in pockets, watching Greaves's head tilt a fraction to the left. He set the codicil down, picked up the letter, and repeated the process. After a few minutes, he shifted both documents back and forth, measuring downstrokes and comparing curves with his brass ruler. The only noises in the room were the faint whir of the radiator and the occasional creak of Greaves's chair. Finally, he removed the loupe, folded his hands, and looked at Wolf. "I should like to state my findings precisely." Wolf inclined his head a quarter inch. "Do so." Greaves tapped the codicil. "This signature, ostensibly by the same hand as the one on the letter, bears identical idiosyncrasies, down to micro-variations in the loop of the capital H and the terminal flick on the final N." I said, "So he was consistent. Some people are." Greaves gave me a brief glance, almost polite. "Consistent, Mr. Goodwin, is not the word I would choose. Identical in every measurable respect is improbable for any two genuine signatures, even executed within minutes of each other. The natural variation of hand ensures this." Wolf's lids lowered, just enough to signal interest without committing to anything more strenuous. "Your conclusion?" "I believe," Greaves said, "that the codicil signature was traced directly from the signature on this letter. The alignment of distinctive points, the pressure marks at stroke changes, the proportional ratios, are exact. That occurs only when one signature is mechanically copied from the other, either by direct tracing or through a transfer method." The radiator hissed on, undisturbed by the pronouncement. I glanced at Wolf. His expression didn't flicker, but his right index finger began a slow tap on the chair arm. "What about ink?" I asked. Greaves shook his head. "Both are in fountain pen ink, consistent with early this year. That proves nothing, as ink of that type remains common. But the pen pressure pattern on the codicil is slightly uneven, in spots where the forger likely paused to adjust alignment. There are microscopic hesitations at curve junctions." Wolf said, "You are confident?" "I am prepared to testify to it in any court in this state." Silence held for a moment, the kind that settles when a decisive card has been played. Wolf broke it. "Thank you, Mr. Greaves. Archie will see to your fee." Greaves began packing his tools. "Do you wish my written report?" "Not at this juncture. Oral suffices. Archie," Wolf gestured toward the hall. I escorted Greaves out, his case tucked under his arm again. At the door, he gave me a courteous nod. "Good evening, Mr. Goodwin." "Yeah, you too." When I came back to the office, Wolf was still in the yellow chair, eyes half closed, the codicil and letter now stacked neatly. "Shall I ring Kramer?" I asked. "No." A single syllable carried enough mass to sink a ferry. I took my desk chair. "You've got a forged codicil, traced from a letter signed by Claudia's husband, and you don't think the homicide squad would be interested. I am not yet prepared to give Mr. Kramer another morsel to misapprehend." Wolf's gaze opened, level on me. "The fact of tracing is instructive, but it is not complete. The inference I require is contingent upon the manner in which the forger obtained both documents. Until I am certain of that, I will not risk spoiling the skein with premature disclosure." I leaned back. "So we sit on it." "We do not sit, Archie. We proceed." That was Wolf for you. Sitting was what his legs did, not his mind. I reached for my notebook. Where to start? With the provenance of both papers, you will determine who had access to the letter during the past 6 months, and to the codicil prior to its emergence. That intersection will be narrow. Somewhere in it stands the man or woman responsible. The radiator hissed again, and outside the fog pressed against the windows like a curious cat. I made a note in my book, flipping back to check dates I'd jotted earlier from Claudia's interview. The letter, I said, was dated in March. She claimed she kept it in her desk at home until she brought it here. The codicil only surfaced last week. Wolf grunted. And the desk at her home, was it secured? Locked, I said. She's got one of those narrow Yale types. Her maid had the run of the place, but she swears no one went into that drawer. Her word for it. I will not accept her oath as proof, Wolf said. You will visit, examine the desk, and ascertain whether the lock is worthy of the word. That means seeing Claudia again. She's not going to be pleased. I am not concerned with her pleasure. He shifted slightly, enough to adjust his posture, without dislodging so much as a crease in his vest. He will also inquire of her late husband's solicitor whether duplicate copies of the codicil existed, and if so, where they resided before this one emerged. I said, that's going to stir the pond. It must be stirred. I closed the notebook. What about Greaves's fee? You want me to write him a check? Yes, generously. His skill is rare. Sure. I got up and moved to the safe in the wall, spun the dial, and came back with Wolf's checkbook. Writing out a figure that would buy me a decent suit, I tore it off and set it aside for mailing. The phone rang. I crossed to answer, but Wolf lifted a hand. No. You expecting someone? I expect interruptions. I do not indulge them. The phone went on ringing until it stopped. Wolf leaned back, eyes half closed again. The picture of a man at rest, except for the faint motion of his lips as he murmured to himself. I knew better than to interrupt when he was sifting his mental file. After a minute, he said, Archie, bring me the list of those present at the reading of the will. I fetched the folder from the cabinet. Wolf opened it, scanning the page with a forefinger. Here, Mr. Hallett, the executor, Miss Dean, the secretary, Claudia, of course, and Mr. Loring, the business partner. All four had opportunity to be alone with one or both documents. Loring, I said. He was there the night the codicil showed up, wasn't he? Yes. You will begin with him. Ascertain his movements in March, particularly any visits to Claudia's house. Won't he smell a rat? I should hope so. A man who does not smell a rat when one is present is of no use to me. I grinned. You've got a way of making friends. I have no interest in friends, Archie. Only in facts. I went to my desk and started drafting a list of questions for Loring. Wolf sat in silence, eyes drifting toward the orchids in the alcove, though I knew his mind wasn't on the flowers. The fog outside thickened, muting the rumble of crosstown traffic. Somewhere down the block, a cab backfired, sharp in the damp air. You want me to see Loring tonight? I asked. Yes, and Miss Dean tomorrow morning, Claudia in the afternoon. That's a lot of shoe leather for one day. It is the nature of the work. I jotted the order in my book, tore the page free, and slipped it into my pocket. When I stood, Wolf added, Be exact in your questions. Do not announce the forgery, merely probe for access. Got it? Anything else? Yes. Take the codicil copy with you when you see Loring. Observe his reaction when you place it before him. You think he'll flinch? I think he will betray something. Whether guilt or innocence, we shall see. I folded the document into a large envelope, slid it into my inside coat pocket, and headed for the hall. Wolf's voice stopped me at the door. Archie? Yeah? Do not, under any circumstance, relinquish that envelope to anyone. Understood. The street was slick under the mist when I stepped outside. Lamps made small islands of light on the pavement. I turned up my collar and started for the corner where I could find a cab. Loring's address was on East 72nd, a brownstone half the size of Wolf's, but done up in polished brass and fresh paint. The maid who opened the door was young and unsmiling. I gave her my card and said I needed to see Mr. Loring on business connected to the Hallett estate. She left me in a narrow hall with a gilt mirror and came back a minute later to lead me into a sitting room. Loring was there, tall and spare in a dark suit, a drink in hand. Mr. Goodwin, he said. To what do I owe the honour? I took a seat uninvited. Mr. Wolf's compliments. We're reviewing some details from March, around the time of Mr. Hallett's letter to his wife. Loring's brow lifted. March? That was months before the codicil turned up. Exactly. Did you visit Mrs. Hallett then? Once, perhaps twice. We were finalizing certain business transfers. Did you have occasion to be in her study? His gaze held mine for a beat too long. I may have passed through. Why? I took the envelope from my pocket and laid it on the low table between us. Recognize this? He leaned forward, opened the flap, and drew out the codicil. His eyes scanned it and came back to me. It's the one they read last week. You've seen it before? No. This is my first look. His tone was steady, but his hand twitched as he set it down. I filed that away. You know of anyone who might have had access to both this and the letter from March? I asked. Only Mrs. Hallett. You're certain? He smiled without warmth. If you're implying I forged anything, Mr. Goodwin, I suggest you leave. I stood, taking the envelope. We'll be in touch. Outside, the mist had thickened to a drizzle again. I found a cab and gave the driver Wolf's address. Back at the brownstone, I hung up my coat and went straight to the office. Wolf looked up from the book on his lap. Well? He says he's never seen the codicil before last week, but his hand gave a twitch when he handled it. Wolf closed the book. And the other matters? I'll see Miss Dean in the morning, Claudia after that. Good. We are closer, Archie. The tracing is the thread. Follow it, and we may find the hand that held the pen. The radiator hissed again, when his body began to betray him, when the house on Lido Beach grew quieter, colder. Tommy Lucchese still made sure the glass stayed clean. He'd sit in his armchair by the window, a tan raincoat draped over his knees, and stare out toward the grey expanse of Long Island Sound, where gulls cut slow arcs and tugboats moved without fanfare. He never said what he saw in the water. Maybe nothing. Maybe the world as it should have been, calm, structured, always in motion. He didn't speak much anymore, not to his wife, not to his doctor, not even to the few remaining men who still came to report with hats in hand and heads slightly bowed. But Tommy Lucchese didn't need to speak. He hadn't spoken loudly in 30 years, and yet the city still listened. By the mid-1960s, Tommy was in his mid-60s, and the cancer had begun to take root. Quietly at first, like everything he did. A dull ache in his chest, a lost appetite. Then the diagnosis, brain tumor, malignant, inoperable. The doctors offered options, surgery, radiation, medication. Tommy declined most of it. What mattered now wasn't recovery. It was order. He had no intention of dying in chaos. Not while the family still stood. Not while the empire still breathed. Despite running one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history, very few photos exist of Lucchese. There's one of him standing beside a horse at a racetrack. Another, grainy and overexposed, shows him shaking hands with a city councilman in 1954. But ask most people on the street in 1966 who ran New York's unions, who pulled the strings at JFK Airport, who controlled which construction crews poured the cement for the new housing projects in Brooklyn, and you get blank stares. Tommy Lucchese was a ghost that built the city. He never raised his voice, never went to jail, never sat for interviews. While others, Genovese, Anastasia, Costello, had bullet scars or headlines to mark their legend, Lucchese left behind footsteps too soft to follow. But those close to him saw the decline. They noticed he now kept the curtains drawn halfway, that he used his raincoat even when it wasn't raining, that he held the stair rail tighter. The cancer was eroding more than his body. It was thinning the veil he had so carefully drawn around his world. He began to withdraw. The meetings became fewer, shorter. The circle of trusted advisors tightened until it was little more than 3 men and a memory. But from that quiet perch above Long Island Sound, Lucchese still orchestrated power with precision. He signed off on a new waste management contract in Yonkers. He reviewed union appointments in the garment district. He corrected a misstep made by a mid-level captain attempting to skim from an airport kickback operation. No threats, just a letter, unsigned, delivered in a white envelope with a typed return address. Lighthouse Printing Supply. But the world was changing faster than even he could slow it. New faces were rising, ambitious, loud, hungry. The kind who made deals on the phone. The kind who talked too much at bars. The kind who thought fear worked better than discipline. Tommy didn't trust them, not because they were violent, but because they were sloppy, One of his oldest advisors, a man named Salvatore Manzo, tried to assure him that the younger generation would learn. Tommy didn't reply. He just turned his eyes back to the water and whispered, more to himself than anyone else. They don't understand the silence. In his final years, Lucchese became something more than a man. He became a myth in motion. The men who came to see him treated the visits like a pilgrimage. They brought no weapons, only updates, questions, small favors. They sat low in the chair across from him, spoke slowly, and listened carefully. Tommy would nod. Sometimes he'd tilt his head. And when the meeting ended, he rarely gave an answer. But if he hadn't stopped you, that meant the answer was yes. He became obsessed with details again, just like in the beginning. The polish on his shoes, the crease of a collar, the timing of a newspaper delivery. There was no paranoia in it, not in the clinical sense. Just a deep, abiding belief that if the small things slipped, the big things followed. Even when his body began to fail, when walking down the hallway required effort and sleep came in strange, heavy waves, Tommy still corrected the spacing between his cufflinks. The cancer didn't scare him, disorder did. He received offers of tribute. Leaders from other families sent gestures, cases of wine, framed photographs, even one with the gall to send a gold-plated cane. Tommy refused most of it. He didn't want gifts. He wanted silence. What comforted him were routine and results. If the trucks ran on time, if the unions remained loyal, if the police still walked past the right doors without knocking, then it meant the world still moved as it should. And if the world moved, he still mattered. By 1967, the tumor was growing fast. His eyesight began to fail. He lost track of days. He stopped attending family dinners, choosing instead to sit in the dim light of his study, window cracked, radio humming soft jazz he no longer seemed to hear. He didn't speak of death, didn't ask for priests or confessions. He didn't believe in forgiveness, only in function. His last known official act was signing off on a leadership transition plan, one that named his successor, set rules for the next 5 years, and embedded veto authority in a safe deposit box accessible only by 3 men. Even as he was dying, he micromanaged legacy. On July 13th, 1967, Tommy Lucchese died in his bed in silence. No headlines screamed, no sirens wailed, no enemies celebrated. He was buried in a grey suit, black tie, white gloves, a plain casket, no eulogy. Just a crowd of men in hats who stood in complete stillness beneath a humid sky as dirt touched the lid. No names were spoken, but everyone there knew. They were burying the last man who understood what it meant to hold power without showing it. In the years that followed, others would take his place, louder, messier, more violent. The Lucchese family itself would fracture. Arrests, informants, murders in diners, deals gone wrong. But for a time, a long time, the city had moved with grace, because the man in the raincoat watched it, corrected it, protected it, and even after he was gone, the systems he built outlived him, like a city that still runs on blueprints drawn by a man no one remembers, but everyone depends on. The day after Tommy Lucchese died, the New York Times ran a small obituary. It sat beneath a column about union strikes and above an advertisement for a Ford sedan. The headline didn't use the word mob or mafia. It simply read, Thomas Lucchese, 67, industrial consultant, dies at Lido Beach. No mention of racketeering, no reference to organized crime, no suggestion that the man who had just passed away once held more invisible power than most governors. That was the brilliance of Tommy Lucchese. He built an empire without leaving fingerprints. And when he was gone, the silence was so complete, it took years for the world to understand what had vanished. Within weeks of his death in July 1967, the cracks began to show. Behind the curtain, the Lucchese crime family, once the most stable and efficient in the 5 families, began to shift. Not violently, at first. Quiet moves, suspicious glances. Ambitions held too long now pushing through the soil. Lucchese had chosen a successor, Carmine Mr. Gribbs Tremonti, a man older than most of the captains under him, selected less for charisma than for predictability. But Tremonti was not Lucchese. He didn't understand systems. He didn't see the importance of balance. Where Tommy had led by orchestrating silence, Tremonti tried to lead by controlling noise, and the system responded with fractures. The Lucchese family's inner economy, its garment union rackets, airport kickbacks, trucking tendrils, and labor negotiations began to loosen. Not collapse, not overnight, but weaken in the way that only things built on respect begin to decay when the source of that respect is gone. Some captains tried to replicate Tommy's discipline. Others interpreted his absence as an invitation for expansion. Within a year, quiet bribes turned into loud shakedowns. Well-timed favors gave way to sloppy intimidation. And the city, still moving, still bleeding into itself, began to notice. Federal investigators, who had once failed to bring charges against Lucchese, now found themselves with easier targets. In 1973, just 6 years after Lucchese's death, Carmine Tremonti was indicted in a massive heroin trafficking operation that linked the Lucchese family to the French Connection pipeline. He was convicted a year later, sentenced to 15 years in prison. Lucchese's family was now in federal custody, its reputation traded for short-term greed. And yet, Tommy's legacy did not vanish. It shifted. It became a template, a quiet standard whispered from consigliere to captain, from old-timer to rising soldier. In back rooms across Brooklyn, the Bronx, Staten Island, older men still quoted him, though few had ever met him in person. They'd say, "Tommy didn't shout, and look how far he got." They'd remember stories about how he solved conflicts without bullets, how he handled crooked judges by removing temptation, not threatening family, how he built trust by remembering names, by knowing the birthdays of daughters, by saying no more often than yes. Even men in other families, Carlo Gambino especially, revered Lucchese's methods. Gambino had watched Lucchese operate for decades, had trusted him more than anyone else at the commission table. After Lucchese's death, Gambino shifted his own strategy, moving even further into the shadows. He began consolidating power without press. He mimicked Lucchese's use of non-violence as leverage. He instructed his men to watch before acting, and act only if you're not seen. The model was clear. Tommy Lucchese had taught the Mafia how to whisper. Years passed. The American underworld changed. The headlines in the 1980s were louder now. Paul Castellano shot outside Sparks Steakhouse, John Gotti in silk ties, courtroom dramas, media coverage, wiretaps, RICO charges. Mobsters became celebrities. Celebrities became targets. But Lucchese remained untouched. Even in death, he was not a myth. He was a method. His name didn't appear in film scripts. There were no Hollywood blockbusters about him. He wasn't dramatized like Capone. He wasn't romanticized like Lucky Luciano. But inside FBI briefings, his name held weight. Agents studying labor corruption and influence networks still looked to Lucchese's system. How he layered his commands, how he segmented his rackets, how no single man ever had the full picture. He didn't build a personality cult. He built a machine. And machines don't mourn. They continue until they rust. In the late 1980s, during a private recorded conversation, a retired Gambino associate said, "Tommy was different. He didn't need you to fear him. You just didn't want to disappoint him." That was the weight of his presence. He wasn't loved. He wasn't hated. He was respected like a clock that always ran on time. One story, rarely verified, but often repeated, tells of a young soldier in the mid-1970s who asked his capo why the family couldn't just go bigger, shake more people down, press harder. The capo stared at him and said, "You don't dig deeper if you don't know where the pipes are. Tommy taught us that." The lesson was metaphorical, but the meaning was clear. If you move loud, you break the system. If you move smart, the system moves with you. Lucchese was, in essence, the anti-Gotti. Where John wore power like a coat, Tommy wore it like a shadow. Where others chased heat, Tommy chased durability. Where others looked to dominate a moment, Lucchese built systems meant to outlast eras. He didn't leave memoirs. He didn't confess to reporters on his deathbed. He didn't arrange for statues or plaques. What he left behind were mechanisms. Labor officials who still operated on principles he'd established. Judges who ruled cautiously because they remembered the favors owed in the 1950s. Shipping terminals whose routes still bore the fingerprints of a man gone 20 years. He didn't care about legacy. He cared about efficiency. And in that, he achieved what few gangsters ever have. Immortality, not in myth, but in structure. In the modern era, the Lucchese family still exists, though it has fractured, diminished, modernized. Today, its name lives in surveillance reports, cold case files, and federal indictments that trace shadows back to systems no one fully understands anymore. But Tommy Lucchese is rarely named, and perhaps that is the point, because his greatest triumph was not what he built. It was that he built it in such a way that he could vanish from it entirely, and it would still work. A boy from Palermo, a limp from a factory machine, a name no one could spell, a voice few ever heard. And yet, for nearly 4 decades, New York moved when he did. Courts paused, contracts shifted, labor wars ended with handshakes no one saw. And when he died, the system he built began to fade, not with a bang, but with a forgetting. In the end, Tommy Lucchese left behind no monument, no blood-soaked legend, no throne. What he left was far more enduring. He left behind a doctrine, that power, when true, does not need spectacle, that silence, when earned, echoes louder than sirens, and that real influence is not what is seen, it is what is felt, in the spaces no one notices, until they're gone.
It begins in silence, not the silence of absence, but of ritual, thick, incense-soaked, holy. The stained glass windows of Our Lady of Peace Church, nestled between tenements on East 62nd Street in Little Italy, catch the late morning sun and scatter it like shards across the wooden pews. At the far end of the nave, just beneath the crucifix, a boy kneels in white robes, his head bowed, his hands folded at the edge of the altar. He doesn't speak, doesn't shift. His name is Aniello Dellacroce. He is 12. And for the last hour he has been listening, not to sermons, but to whispers. The confessions of the broken, the tired, the wicked. They come not to be judged, only to be heard. Born in 1914 in the narrow corridor of tenements near Cherry Street, Aniello was the second son of Calabrian immigrants, his father a dock worker, his mother a seamstress who spoke only in whispers herself. Their apartment was 4 rooms and 2 windows. The floorboards groaned, the walls breathed mildew, and the air smelled of boiled wool. In that world, words were measured like bread rations, too many, and you went hungry. Aniello learned early that power didn't come from noise. It came from stillness, from listening, from remembering. He wasn't like other boys on the block. Where others ran, Aniello walked. Where others shouted, he watched. In church, he served Mass not out of devotion, but out of duty. It was structure, and within structure, there was peace. He sat close to the priests, listened to the cadence of their Latin, memorized their eyes, the way they studied sinners like a physician reads pulse. And when he knelt behind the velvet curtain, acting as proxy for a priest too ill to hear confessions himself, Aniello absorbed the weight of sin without flinching. Lies, infidelity, theft, beatings, broken vows, all delivered in murmurs, like offerings placed into his palms. He never repeated a word, not to his father, not to his priest, not even to himself. He simply folded them into a growing ledger of silence. It was during those early years that something irreversible settled in him. A belief, not in God's judgment, but in man's capacity to sin without consequence. If men could unburden themselves so easily, he thought, perhaps guilt was never the punishment. Maybe it was the price of permission. In 1928, at the age of 14, Aniello stopped attending Mass altogether. He left the robes behind, took work sweeping floors at a shipping warehouse off South Street. The city, too, was shedding its innocence. Prohibition had turned New York into a cathedral of contradictions. The sacred and profane lived on opposite sides of the same block. Politicians dined with racketeers. Judges shook hands with bootleggers. The police raided a speakeasy one week and took payment from it the next. Aniello watched, not with disdain, not with awe, with recognition. The world didn't run on justice. It ran on quiet arrangements. He came under the wing of Vincent Mangano, the then boss of what would later become the Gambino crime family. Aniello was tall, lean, unreadable. He didn't ask questions, he didn't boast, and he didn't lose his temper. Mangano noticed. He gave Aniello a small job, collection on Fulton Street, a seamstress who'd fallen behind. Aniello didn't shout, didn't even threaten. He simply explained, calmly, what would happen if she continued to fall behind. And when she cried, he handed her a clean handkerchief, said nothing, and left. She paid the next day, and never missed again. That was the moment Mangano understood something rare. Aniello Dellacroce didn't enforce fear. He inspired inevitability. By 1931, he had moved into enforcement, though he never called it that. He didn't see violence as cruelty. He saw it as correction. Not punishment, balance. He carried a razor in his shoe, not a pistol. Wore dark coats, flat caps, and gloves that never bore blood for long. He walked like a priest, moved like a blade. And when he was asked to do the unthinkable, to bury secrets that could never be whispered again, he never hesitated. They called him the tall, silent one, not because he wouldn't speak, but because he didn't need to. A glance, a breath, a tilt of the head, that was enough. His reputation grew not on headlines, but on the absence of them. No loud scenes, no messy aftermaths, just a name that passed through the ranks like a warning carved in stone. By the 1940s, Dellacroce had become Mangano's primary enforcer. Not just for hits, but for internal discipline. He was the man sent to calm hot tempers, to correct infractions, to warn captains who'd grown too ambitious. And yet, he never took pleasure in punishment. He didn't drink. He didn't laugh during beatings. He didn't celebrate revenge. To him, these were sacraments. He was a man built by the confessional, carrying out penance with the precision of ritual. One story, recorded years later by an informant, describes Dellacroce entering a diner on Hester Street, where a rogue soldier had been hiding after skimming from the family's loan sharking operation. Aniello sat beside him in the booth, didn't order food, didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "You've already confessed. All that's left is to finish the prayer." The man didn't return home, and no one ever found the body. But the skimming stopped. Even within the family, he was a mystery. He read books on psychology, preferred classical music, carried a rosary even though he no longer prayed. He believed in hierarchy, duty, and finality. In an underworld growing louder with every generation, Dellacroce was a relic of discipline, a reminder of the older codes when silence was law and blood was sacred. And yet, he was not cold, not entirely. He showed mercy to first-time offenders, paid hospital bills for the wives of men he had reprimanded. Once, after a young associate was gunned down for failing to follow orders, Aniello personally delivered groceries to the boy's mother for 6 months. He never signed the notes, just left them on the stoop, wrapped in brown paper, as if guilt were its own tithe. By the 1950s, as Mangano faded and Albert Anastasia took control,
Dellacroce remained the spine of the family. Other men talked business. Aniello executed judgment. But something had begun to shift. Power was getting noisier. More headlines, more ego, more spectacle. Dellacroce, who had once heard confessions in pews beneath painted saints, now walked among men who boasted their sins like badges. He didn't resist the change. He simply watched it carefully, as a priest might study a cracked chalice, still useful, but no longer sacred. In the years to come, he would rise higher, much higher. He would become underboss to Carlo Gambino. He would mentor John Gotti. He would sit in dark rooms and decide who lived, who vanished, and who got one more chance. But all of that came later. This moment, this scene, belongs to the boy in the church, the one who knelt in silence, who heard sins and didn't flinch, who learned that truth, once spoken, carried weight, and that the man who heard it carried more. Aniello Dellacroce did not become a gangster. He became a confessor with no absolution to offer. And in the world that awaited him, that was exactly what was needed. He was a boy of rules. Not the rules written on signs or stitched into law books, but the unwritten kind passed through glances at the dinner table and through hands calloused from silence. Born in 1914, in the tenement shadows of East 108th Street, Aniello Dellacroce entered the world just as it was unraveling. His parents had crossed from Calabria 3 years earlier, dragging with them little more than a broken dialect and the memory of olive groves now buried beneath debt. They settled in New York's Italian slums, where everything reeked of fish, gaslight, and evaporated hope. The family didn't starve, but they did not dream either. They endured. They obeyed. They stayed small, even when hurt. In that home, Neil, as the American teachers would later call him, learned that loyalty was not optional. It was the structure around which everything else bent. If his father told him to sweep the hallway, he did it twice. If his older brother was beaten outside the grocer's stall, Neil said nothing. not even when his lip split from a bottle cracked across his face. He returned home, washed the blood in cold water, ate dinner without speaking. His father looked at him, nodded once, and said, "Buono." That was love. That was how you earned place. He was 16 the first time he saw a man die. It happened in the alley behind Monaco's cafe, after a debt went unpaid for too long and too loudly. The man who fell wasn't from the neighborhood. The one who pulled the trigger was. No one screamed. No one ran. Neil stood still, holding a box of bread wrapped in twine. He stared at the steam rising from the body's mouth like the last confession that never came. The shooter, a low-level soldier with calm eyes and tailored cuffs, looked at Neil, met his gaze, didn't blink. Later that week, a note arrived in Neil's pocket during Sunday Mass. No name, just an address, a time. He went. The door belonged to Albert Anastasia. To the outside world, he was just another businessman. Ran a union, knew people at the docks. But to those who counted, Anastasia was the high priest of consequence, one of the architects of what would soon be whispered as Murder, Inc. He welcomed Neil into a sitting room lined with dusty curtains and too many chairs. No smiles, no small talk. Just an offer. You work, you don't talk. That's the whole thing. You do that, you'll never need to ask for anything. Neil nodded once. He didn't ask what the work was. He already knew. The 1930s were filled with smoke and names no longer found on street signs. Louis Lepke, Bugsy Goldstein, Harry Strauss, Frank Abendando. They were carpenters of death, labouring not in anger, but in exactness. And at the edge of their shadow stood Aniello Dellacroce. He didn't carry a gun at first. He cleaned. He drove. He delivered packages from Borough Park to the Bronx, some wrapped in butcher's paper, others in silence. What set him apart was not his skill, it was his calm. When bullets flew, Neil did not flinch. When a man screamed, Neil turned his head slightly, not in disgust, but in concentration, like he was learning a language he'd always suspected existed. Anastasia took note. He began pulling Neil closer, into the rooms where blood was planned, not spilled, where allegiances were crafted like blueprints. He saw in Neil not a killer, but something rarer, a disciple, a man who viewed the Mafia not as crime, but as code. To Neil, there was no contradiction between the cross he wore around his neck and the work he did in its shadow. God judged the soul, men judged the flesh, and the flesh, he believed, must be made to respect order. He began to rise, not through politics, not through connections, through consistency. He never lied, never exaggerated, never asked questions he didn't already know the answers to. He showed up early, left late, cleaned his own knife, never drank more than one glass. He memorized birthdays. He knew the shoe sizes of every man he worked beside. One night, when a soldier forgot to pick up his child from school during a turf dispute in Bushwick, Neil personally went, stood outside the building in the rain, black coat buttoned, hat low. The child never saw the gun beneath the jacket. No words were exchanged. The next morning, that soldier swore an oath to Neil, and meant it. His first kill came during a union dispute involving a warehouse in Red Hook. The target was a foreman who had broken his word. Neil didn't hesitate. He didn't flinch. But when it was over, he didn't speak for 2 days. Not out of guilt, but out of respect. He believed that killing was not a punishment. It was a ritual, and rituals should not be sullied with celebration. In time, Anastasia promoted him to direct oversight of his southern Brooklyn operations. Dock work, gambling, loans, enforcement. Neil ran it like a chapel, schedules, rotations, clean books. He didn't tolerate disobedience, but he didn't punish men for mistakes made in good faith, only for disloyalty, only for disorder. He taught his crew 2 rules. Never talk more than necessary. If you raise your voice, it's because you've already lost. Those who broke the rules didn't always die, but they never walked the same again. By the early 1940s, the name Dellacroce carried weight, not because it was feared, but because it was predictable. You knew where he stood, you knew the price of disrespect, and you knew that if he said nothing, that meant you had already been forgiven, or damned. He married once, quietly, no fanfare. The reception was held in the back of a tavern, with more priests than gangsters in attendance. He danced one slow song with his bride, then returned to work the next day. He had 2 children, a boy and a girl. They knew their father worked in labor. They knew never to answer the phone on the second ring. And as the mafia became more public, more aggressive, more bloated, Dellacroce remained anchored in the doctrine of the old world. Silence, loyalty, structure, sacred order. He kept his house in Howard Beach simple. Modest furniture, clean floors, books on psychology stacked beside the ashtray. He read Marcus Aurelius, underlined passages in red. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. That was Neil, a man born from silence, forged by ritual, raised not by ambition, but by a code that left no room for ego. In time, he would inherit a greater title, become underboss, become feared, become respected. But beneath it all, he remained the same man, the boy who once knelt at the edge of a pew, hearing sins he could not name, and understanding, even then, some things could never be forgiven, only corrected. It happened in a barbershop, mid-morning, October 25th, 1957. Albert Anastasia, head of what was then still called the Mangano family, the Lord High Executioner of Murder, Inc., stepped into the Park Sheraton Hotel at 56th Street and 7th Avenue for a shave. He sat in a leather chair beneath a wall of mirrors and leaned back, his eyes half closed, the towel warm against his throat, the razor glinting in steam. He never saw the men enter. Two figures in trench coats, faces covered, no warning, no shout, just bullets, 5 of them to the head and torso. One even ricocheted off the mirror and cut the face of a boy hiding behind the counter. Anastasia's body fell to the tile like a felled monument, still wearing his robe, still clutching the arms of the chair like he might rise again. He wouldn't. The city reeled. The newspapers called it a betrayal. The underworld knew it was a message. A new regime was taking shape. One that wouldn't tolerate spectacle. One that traded fire for form, power for precision. And standing in the eye of that storm, not flinching, was Aniello Dellacroce. To many, Dellacroce had been Anastasia's shadow, his enforcer, his confidant, his spiritual twin. He had enforced Anastasia's will like Doctrine, silent, relentless, cold. But when Albert was murdered, Aniello did not call for revenge. He did not summon soldiers. He did not send back blood. He waited, listened. And then he knelt, not before vengeance, but before Carlo Gambino. Gambino had helped arrange the assassination. Quietly, strategically. Where Anastasia had ruled with thunder, Gambino governed with ice. And for most men in Dellacroce's shoes, the shift in power would have brought fury, pride, blood. But Dellacroce believed in the code above the man. And the code said this: if the boss dies and you live, your loyalty goes not to the corpse, but to the chair. So he aligned with Gambino, fully, without question. He walked into a meeting on Mott Street less than a week after the killing, looked Carlo in the eye and said, "I serve the chair, as long as it's filled." That was all. No speech, no oath, no backroom theatrics. Just submission to order, like a monk who does not need to love the abbot to worship the rule. Gambino, in turn, promoted him to underboss. It wasn't a reward, it was an acknowledgement. Dellacroce was the quiet spine of the family, the man who could hold discipline like a crucifix and bleed chaos out of a room just by walking into it. His territory became Midtown Manhattan, from the garment rackets on 34th Street to the construction corridors of Hell's Kitchen. Every strip club, every numbers racket, every muscle job and tax scam between Broadway and the East River answered to Dellacroce, and they answered carefully. He never smiled, not at weddings, not at baptisms, not even at his daughter's graduation. He wore black suits, even in summer, carried no visible weapon, sat silently during meals, didn't drink more than 1 glass of wine. His men said he never lost his temper because he had nothing left to lose. That wasn't quite true. What Dellacroce had was devotion to the code, to silence, to a vision of the mafia as a sacred order, not a television script. And to break that order wasn't just foolish, it was blasphemy. A story from 1959. One of his soldiers, a man named Ralphie Montini, skipped protocol and tried to tax a Harlem bookmaker without permission. Dellacroce summoned him. No violence, no shouting, just a quiet dinner in a private room above a butcher shop on 9th Avenue. They ate veal, drank Chianti. Dellacroce listened to Ralphie explain himself. When he was done, Dellacroce leaned forward, wiped his mouth, and said, "God forgives the sin, I correct it." Ralphie disappeared the next day. Fear was not his weapon. Discipline was. Soldiers feared him not because he punished disobedience with death, but because he punished it without emotion. To them, Dellacroce didn't represent wrath. He represented consequence. He spoke in few words, but when he did, his voice carried like scripture. You don't talk. You don't flash. You do what you're told. And you carry the weight. Weight. That's what Dellacroce believed made a man. Not status, not riches. Weight. The burden of the code, carried in silence. He ran Midtown with military symmetry. Crews rotated on schedule. Cut percentages were balanced with lawyer retainers. Payoffs to cops were routed through legit construction companies, laundered through real bank accounts, and delivered in envelopes with no names. Only numbers. He had lieutenants who never met each other. Drivers who never saw his face. And when he walked the streets of 45th and 8th, men stood straighter, as if a funeral procession had passed and demanded reverence. Yet beneath that control, he suffered. Dellacroce believed suffering was not weakness. It was purification. He would sit in the dark for hours. No television, no music. Just a cigarette, a ledger, and the quiet. He believed that the pain made the loyalty real. That without pain, honor meant nothing. He once told a young soldier, "Every day you follow the code, you lose something. A little sleep, a little love, maybe your name. That's how you know it's working." In the commission meetings, he was the anchor between wolves. When bosses bickered, Dellacroce stayed silent until all others had spoken. When asked for a vote, he gave it once, and never repeated himself. Gambino trusted him like a judge trusts a bailiff, with the weight of the institution, with quiet obedience. Dellacroce never overstepped, never whispered about succession, never courted attention. He was power's shadow, and in that shadow, he became something more than feared. He became trusted. By the early 1960s, Dellacroce's name was known across the 5 boroughs, not through newspapers or arrest sheets, but through tone. If a man said, "Neil sent me," no one asked for proof. If a man said, "Don't let Neil hear about this," the room went still. His name became permission or warning, depending on how it was said. And yet, he never asked to be remembered, only obeyed. The FBI began watching him closely, but could find almost nothing. No photos, no wiretaps that held water, no willing witnesses. One agent remarked, "You couldn't pin anything on Dellacroce because he didn't leave footprints, only shadows, and shadows don't testify." When the decade turned and newer faces entered the life, louder, more flamboyant, Dellacroce held firm. He watched them flash gold, watched them race cars, throw parties, whisper to girls in clubs about who they worked for. And he wrote it down, silently, in the book inside his head. Because he knew men who disrespected the code would one day need someone to bury them. And Dellacroce never turned away from a burial. He had inherited a world covered in blood, but he never chased the violence. He carried it, like a priest carries a cross, like a judge carries the gavel, never smiling, never softening, never asking for anything except the next task to be done. There was a building on Canal Street, wedged between a shuttered tailor shop and a pawn office that never changed its neon sign. No number on the door, no mailbox, just a black awning and a single brass knob that had been polished by generations of hesitant fingers. Street. To most, it was nothing. A forgotten office in a forgotten stretch of lower Manhattan. But inside, behind thick walls and blinds that were never opened past dawn, sat Aniello Dellacroce, the last man you'd ever confess to, and the first man you feared disappointing. He wasn't a boss. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't even the one who signed the orders anymore. But he was the one they came to, and they came in silence. The room was always the same. Black carpet, cream-colored blinds, 2 chairs across from a wide desk made of dark walnut. Nothing on the desk except a notepad, a fountain pen, a letter opener, and, most importantly, a rosary, its beads worn smooth like river stones. Behind the desk, Dellacroce sat perfectly still, suited, polished. Shoes shined like mirrors, hair combed like it had been done by a mortician. Everything about the man was exact, from the razor edge of his lapels to the way he folded his handkerchief. To sit across from him was to sit in judgment, but without the comfort of knowing what crime you were on trial for. By the early 1970s, Dellacroce had become more than a man. He He was the underworld's confessor, the one who didn't need to speak to be understood. If you ran a crew in Brooklyn and your soldier got greedy, you called Neil. If the Irish were getting restless in Hell's Kitchen, you sent a bottle and a message. Ask Mr. D to visit. If Gotti and his boys were circling too close to the flame, Dellacroce stepped between them and the future they weren't ready for. He never raised his voice, not with the Westies, those Irish street soldiers from Hell's Kitchen known for their drunken knives and twitchy loyalty. Not with the Colombians, who started sniffing at Midtown's nightlife in cheap suits and expensive cologne. Dellacroce didn't argue. He didn't explain. He mediated the way a scale balances weight, with stillness and pressure applied at the exact right point. He'd invite both sides, sit them down, pour a drink but not touch his own. Then, when the silence was too loud to ignore, he'd ask one question. Who do you fear more, each other or me? They always chose wisely. His mornings began at 6 o'clock a.m., always the same. Wake, shower, shave, with a blade he sharpened himself, press his shirt until it held shape without a body, tie his shoes after saying the rosary, never before. He said it not out of piety, but ritual. The rhythm grounded him, the words connected him to something older than blood. And every time he muttered, "Lead us not into temptation," he thought of the men around him, the Gotti types, who treated temptation like a badge, not a warning. Dellacroce knew John Gotti was a storm coming, too flashy, too loud, too desperate to be seen. But he also saw something in the young hood from Queens, a fire that hadn't yet chosen what to burn. So he took him in, not as a son, not as a successor, but as a student. He gave Gotti territory, let him taste control, and more importantly, taught him when to shut up. Because Dellacroce knew the worst kind of gangster wasn't the one who killed recklessly. It was the one who talked too much in a room where memory outlived breath. Every item in Dellacroce's office had a purpose. The ashtray was always clean, not because he didn't smoke, but because he cleaned it himself after every cigarette. The blinds were always tilted just so, enough to let in light, never enough to let anyone see in. The phone, old, black, rotary, was placed to the left of his chair, exactly 12 inches from the corner. He never let anyone else answer it. And when a man walked in and sat across from him, Dellacroce didn't look at them right away. He let them sit in the space between judgment and mercy. Because in that space, men tell the truth, even if they don't say a word. The FBI watched the building for years. They set up cameras, bugs, sent informants. But they got almost nothing. No fingerprints, no voices raised. Just one man in a chair, reading ledgers and listening to the sins of the city. One agent wrote in a memo, "We can't prosecute ritual. We can't arrest silence. We can't indict fear." The Westies, despite their chaos, followed Dellacroce like monks. He didn't dress like them, didn't drink with them, didn't trust them, but he gave them something no Italian had before: structure. He laid out boundaries, told them what streets were theirs, what rules applied. And when two of them tortured a loan shark without permission, he didn't retaliate with bullets. He summoned them to Canal Street, made them wait. Then, when they entered, he pointed to two chairs and said, "If you sit, you live. If you stand, you walk out of this room." They sat. One of them later said, "I'd rather get shot than disappoint him." Even Carlo Gambino, the boss of bosses, deferred to Neil on certain matters. Because while Gambino controlled the family structure, Dellacroce controlled its soul. He understood that power wasn't in having your name feared, it was in not needing your name at all. He never married again after his wife died. Lived in the back apartment behind his office, alone. No pictures on the walls, no music. Just a crucifix over the bed and a safe bolted to the floor. The men he raised into killers, thieves, and fixers would sometimes ask him, "Aren't you lonely?" He would reply, without lifting his head, "A man can be alone without being lost, but not the other way around." By the late 70s, his health had begun to crack. The ulcer got worse. The coughing never stopped. And yet, he still showed up. Pressed suit, polished shoes, rosary in pocket. Still listening. Still judging. The younger generation, the ones who worshipped speedboats and nightclubs, couldn't understand him. They called him old-fashioned. But they never disobeyed. Because the old ways weren't gone. They were just buried inside him, waiting to be passed on, or buried with him. He had one ritual no one ever interrupted. Every Sunday night, just before midnight, He would pour himself 2 fingers of bourbon, light a single cigarette, and stare out the window facing the alley. Sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes an hour, not watching, not waiting, just witnessing, as if remembering every man who walked through that door, every sin confessed, every debt collected. He carried those memories like relics, and he never spoke of them. By the time the commission trial swept through the city in the mid-1980s, Dellacroce was already fading. The cancer had taken his appetite. The coughs shook his frame. But still, the phone at 174 Canal Street rang. And still, they came. Mobsters, soldiers, friends, enemies, all looking not for orders, but for absolution. Because in the end, Dellacroce wasn't feared for what he might do to you. He was feared for what you might see in yourself when he looked at you. And if you were lucky, he'd nod once, slide the notepad across the desk and say, "You know what to do." That was his blessing, his curse, and his goodbye. By 1983, Aniello Dellacroce had become a relic in a world he once ruled with silence. His suits still fit, but the man inside them didn't. His shoulders sagged. His voice, once sparse but commanding, now sounded like wind moving through empty halls. And the men around him, the ones who had once waited outside 174 Canal Street with caps in hand, now rushed past, chasing newer gods. But it wasn't betrayal that broke him. It was loyalty. Dellacroce had always served the code. Not a boss, not a crew, the code. And that code had once made the Mafia a fortress of rules. No drugs, no civilians, no loose mouths. But in the early 1980s, that fortress had begun to rot from within. At its center stood Paul Castellano, the new boss of the Gambino family. And circling that throne like a storm cloud was John Gotti, impatient, ambitious, and growing louder by the day. Dellacroce stood between them. He had sworn fealty to Castellano when Carlo Gambino died. An oath sealed not with words, but with silence and duty. But he had also raised Gotti like a son, given him queens, protected him from internal politics, guided him when the streets whispered too many promises. Now both men demanded allegiance, and Dellacroce, trapped between legacy and momentum, gave it to both. He still showed up to the office, still pressed his shirts, still cleaned his ashtray after every cigarette. But behind the locked doors, the cancer was spreading, in his bones, in his stomach, in his soul. The doctors called it incurable. Dellacroce didn't ask for details. He simply nodded and walked out. There were things worth suffering for. A slow death was not unfamiliar to a man who had lived through 1,000 betrayals. But this was different. Because the real cancer wasn't in his marrow. It was in the family. Paul Castellano had moved into a Staten Island mansion and stopped attending wakes. He rubbed elbows with Wall Street, spoke in whispers about moving the family toward legitimate business, away from the blood-stained rituals that Dellacroce had devoted a life to maintaining. Dellacroce knew the men resented it, especially Gotti. The idea of an untouchable boss who didn't bleed in the streets, who dressed like a banker and skipped funerals. It went against everything they understood. Gotti called him the Pope, not out of reverence, out of disgust. And yet, when Gotti raged, Dellacroce calmed him. "Paul's the boss. You wait. That's the rule." Gotti listened. For a while. Dellacroce didn't believe in charisma. He believed in structure. He had always said, "Without discipline, we are no different than the Irish." But in those final years, he watched as the discipline decayed. Sit-downs turned into shouting matches. Respect gave way to spectacle. Even the young men started wearing gold watches and silk shirts. He would sit at his desk, run the rosary through his fingers, and feel the weight of irrelevance settling in like dust. There was one night, fall of '85, when Dellacroce sat alone in his office. The lights dim, the room heavy with the smell of tobacco and bourbon. Outside, Manhattan groaned beneath the cold. Inside, his hands trembled. He took out a piece of paper, ivory white, thick, the kind he used for serious matters, and wrote a name at the top, John. He never finished the letter. Instead, he folded the paper in half, placed it in the top drawer of his desk, and whispered, "Don't make me choose." But he had already chosen. By refusing to choose, he had poisoned himself. His body grew thinner, his eyes sunken, and yet every soldier still kissed his hand. Every capo still deferred to him, because they didn't see the illness. They saw duty in decline. A man disintegrating from the inside out, not from weakness, but from trying to hold together a house that no longer wanted its foundation. When Gotti began whispering about Castellano's death, Dellacroce did what he could. Not with threats, not with rage, but with presence. He summoned Gotti to Canal Street. No bodyguards, no drinks, just 2 chairs and silence. "If you act while I'm alive, you betray me." That was all he said. Gotti nodded, stayed quiet. But Dellacroce knew the truth. He could keep the wolf at bay, but he couldn't make it forget hunger. On December 2nd, 1985, Aniello Dellacroce died in his modest apartment behind the office. No priest, no final confession. Just a man, curled in bed, still dressed in a white undershirt, his rosary wrapped around fingers that could no longer hold a pen. The Gambino family didn't just lose a leader that day, they lost its conscience. And within 2 weeks, the wolves would feast. The snow came late that year. Manhattan lay still under a washed grey sky, the kind that never brightened and never fully darkened. Like the city had forgotten how to move forward without him. It was December 5th, 1985, and the line outside the funeral home on 2nd Avenue stretched 2 blocks long. No music played. No voices rose above a murmur. Just the wet shuffle of footsteps and the dull hush of falling snow, soft enough to settle on shoulders, but never bold enough to stick. Inside the Peter C. Labella funeral chapel, a body lay in state beneath low gold lights and red velvet curtains. The room smelled of lilies, floor wax, and the tension of unsaid things. Aniello Dellacroce, the underworld's last monk, a silent architect behind the Gambino dynasty, was laid out in a dark pine casket. No open display, no grand flowers, no silk-lined suit. Just black cloth, a silver crucifix, and a pair of rosary beads tucked between his fingers, worn smooth by decades of prayers that had nothing to do with God. There were no speeches, no family eulogies, just glances exchanged like codes, nods that carried the weight of entire histories. Men filed past the coffin one by one, bosses, soldiers, lieutenants, men who had once ruled corners and cities, and none of them spoke his name aloud, because Dellacroce didn't need to be remembered in words. He was memory itself, the spine of a tradition that was already beginning to rot the moment he drew his last breath. He died just after midnight on December the 2nd, in his apartment above the office on Canal Street. No ceremony, no priest. A single light bulb burned overhead, swaying from its wire like a tired eye. He was found on the floor near his bed, dressed in slacks and a white shirt, a hand reaching for the nightstand, the phone or the rosary, or maybe just one last chance to put something in order. There were no signs of struggle, just a faint scratch on the floor and a fainter trace of blood at the corner of his mouth. Pancreatic cancer had finally done what 30 years of lawmen, rivals, and betrayal could not. It ended him without negotiation. In the days that followed, a strange quiet settled over the streets. Bookies didn't shout numbers on corners. Clubs played older records, slower ones. Even the newspapers, which had barely mentioned his name during his life, now struggled to summarize a man whose power was built on not being seen. The New York Times called him a reputed underworld figure. The men who mattered called him something else. The wall between order and chaos, one whispered. And that wall had just fallen. Inside the chapel, the heat was turned too high, as if the funeral director had tried to push back winter with sheer discomfort. The pews were filled with faces from 3 generations, some fresh, untested, already whispering plans, others lined with age and fatigue, looking not at the casket, but at one another, like survivors of a wreck. Gotti stood near the back, stone-faced, fingers clasped in front of him. He wore a black wool coat with the collar turned up and a silk tie so dark it absorbed the room's light. Behind him, the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club crew lingered in a loose formation, shoulder to shoulder, eyes scanning the exits. Paul Castellano was not in attendance. He sent no flowers, no condolences, not even a low-level envoy. And that, among men who noticed everything, said more than any headline ever could. Dellacroce's death did more than create a power vacuum. It created a moral one. He had been the hinge on which 2 worlds swung, the old world of restraint, of rituals and rules, and the new world of neon ambition, where guns settled arguments and headlines were trophies. With him gone, there was no more hinge, just the yawning doorway of what now? And for John Gotti, the answer was clear. 2 weeks later, on December 16th, 1985, as Castellano exited Sparks Steakhouse with his underboss, Tommy Bellotti, 4 men in trench coats emerged from the shadows. They didn't shout. They didn't hesitate. They fired 10 rounds in less than 7 seconds. The boss of the Gambino crime family lay dead on a midtown sidewalk, blood pooling in the slush around his loafers, steam rising from his jacket like a soul caught between departure and denial. Witnesses would later describe the scene as silent chaos. No screams, just gunshots and sudden absence. It was the most public execution the American Mafia had ever seen, and the moment the old world officially died. But back in that chapel, on that snowy day, that end had not yet arrived. What had arrived was grief of a specific breed, not the grief of family or love or youth lost. This was the grief of men who knew that a system was unraveling, the kind of grief that doesn't weep. It calculates. It watches. It wonders who will betray whom next. And it aches not for the man in the coffin, but for the code that would never again hold. Dellacroce had warned them. He'd told Gotti, plainly, if you act while I'm alive, you betray me. And Gotti had honored that. He waited. Exactly 14 days. It was not revenge. It was timing. And it was that precision that terrified the older men in that funeral home far more than the murder itself. Because if even Gotti, the wild one, the gambler, could delay revenge for the sake of optics and perception, then the Mafia was no longer a place of impulse. It was a theatre. And in this new theatre, image would matter more than blood. And that made it unrecognizable. The funeral procession rolled out of the chapel just after dusk. A line of black cars, long and smooth like scars on the snow. No sirens, no priests, just silence. A manila envelope with his final possessions, and a cold wind that refused to stop blowing east. He was buried in St. John's Cemetery, in Middle Village, Queens, Section 25, Row S, Plot 56. A modest stone, a bare patch of earth. No statue, no marble, just his name, 2 dates, and a cross. The only sound was the grind of the winch lowering him into the ground, that slow mechanical exhale, like the city letting go of something it hadn't realized was holding it together. For weeks after, men visited the grave. Some left coins, others left notes folded into tight squares and weighted down with stones. One left a matchbook from the Ravenite Social Club. Another, curiously, left a copy of the Gospel of Matthew, open to chapter 10, verse 16. Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves. It was a message not just to the dead, but to whoever came next. The city kept moving. The headlines returned to politics, then Wall Street, then a mayor's re-election campaign. But in the corners, in the back rooms, the bars, the basements, a question lingered. What happens to a kingdom when its last priest is gone? And the answer, though whispered, was already roaring. There's a photograph, faded now, slightly warped by time and humidity. It shows Aniello Dellacroce at the edge of a funeral, not his own. He's wearing a dark overcoat, collar turned high, with the brim of his fedora casting half his face in shadow. He's not looking at the camera. He's looking at something beyond it, something only he can see. That image, cold, silent, impenetrable, became the Doctrine. Not a man, but a presence. Not a leader, but a law. Dellacroce never took the throne. He was never crowned boss, never held press conferences like Gotti, never appeared in wiretaps bragging about power. And yet, to this day, his name is spoken with more weight than most who wore the crown. Because Dellacroce didn't need to raise his voice. He was the voice that didn't need raising. In the Mafia, where betrayal was currency and ambition was a knife always an inch too close to the spine, Aniello Dellacroce did something almost supernatural. He made fear elegant. From the cramped tenements of Little Italy to the back rooms of Staten Island social clubs, his name became shorthand for the unbreakable code. Not omerta, that was ritual. This was something deeper, a moral architecture built from silence, loyalty, and consequence. He was known to sit in a room for hours without speaking, just listening, cigarette burning slow in one hand, rosary beads circling through the fingers of the other. No anger, no flair, just that look, that stillness, that almost priestly calm. He didn't blink, one associate said. He didn't have to. To understand his influence, you have to understand what he resisted. The 1980s were an era of gaudy expansion for the American mafia. Flashy suits, public headlines, younger men who craved celebrity more than secrecy, men who wanted to be kings. Dellacroce watched them all, these sons of the Doctrine, chasing lights, not shadows. And in his silence, they saw their reflection and their shame. Because Dellacroce stood for the old world, a world where power was quiet, where money came in envelopes, not headlines, where the job wasn't to be known, but to be obeyed. He believed the underworld only worked if it was colder than the world above. He believed that dignity wasn't optional. It was the only armor you had when the blood came. Even outside the mafia, his shadow lingered. FBI agents who trailed him for years would later admit, off the record, that he was different. Not just because he was hard to catch, but because he was hard to read. You couldn't flip him, one agent said. You couldn't even rattle him. They tried. Wiretaps, informants, financial audits. Nothing cracked him. Because Dellacroce kept no notes, no paper trail, no recordings. His memory was the vault. His desk was clean. Always. Just a cigarette tray, a single pen, and a black telephone that almost never rang. And when it did, he answered with just one word. Never a greeting, never a name. He believed in ritual, almost like religion. Every morning, wake at 5, shave with a straight razor, pray with the rosary. Suit, shoes, tie, everything in the same order, every day. The knot always Windsor, the shoes always polished. His shirt collar never touched the lapels of his jacket. That was sloppiness. To those who worked under him, it was unnerving. To him, it was necessary. Because the world, his world, only worked if it never changed. But change came anyway. After his death in 1985, a younger, louder era took the reins. Gotti turned the mafia into theatre. The newspapers found new names to sensationalize. And Dellacroce? He became myth. His image, no longer anchored to a living man, blurred into something darker, something sacred and unapproachable. He was invoked in whispers during sit-downs. His style cited during moments of chaos, as if the doctrine he left behind could still hold back the tide. Some say he saved Gotti's life, not physically, but spiritually. Because without Dellacroce, Gotti would have moved too soon, killed Castellano while his mentor was still alive, broken the only code that mattered. But Dellacroce's doctrine wasn't about survival, it was about order. And even when Gotti broke from it, even when he lit the match 2 weeks after Dellacroce's funeral, he did it knowing that the fire he unleashed could never be contained again. You see, Dellacroce didn't rule by fear, he ruled by expectation. He made men afraid not of punishment, but of disappointing the standard. He didn't leave behind legions of killers. He left behind disciples. Some kept their heads down and vanished into obscurity. Some rose, briefly, before the law or ambition swallowed them whole. And some just carried his name like a shield, invoking it in rooms where nothing else would protect them. There's a story, maybe true, maybe just gospel for gangsters. In 1997, during a sit-down between two feuding crews in Jersey, the conversation hit a wall. Guns under the table, voices rising, a deal slipping. Then one of the older men at the table leaned forward and said, "This ain't how Dellacroce would have handled it." And just like that, silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They reached a deal in 6 minutes. Because even a decade dead, he still had veto power. Dellacroce didn't believe in second chances. Not because he was cruel, but because second chances meant someone hadn't been watching close enough the first time. To him, the mafia wasn't a business. It was a covenant. Break the rules, and you didn't just lose your seat, you lost your name. And in his world, that was the real death. Today, his legacy is harder to trace. The families have fractured, the rules rewritten, the code a relic. But in the shadows, in the few corners where the old ways still hold, his presence lingers. Not in statues, not in plaques, but in habits, in silences, in the sharp edge of a suit cuff, the clean surface of a desk, the whispered invocation of a name that once meant discipline and death in the same breath. Aniello Dellacroce. He never chased power, he embodied it. There's a street in Manhattan, quiet, almost invisible. It runs between stone towers and polished glass. just a narrow vein of shadow tucked beneath the noise. If you pass it quickly, you'd never know it was once the spinal cord of an empire. No plaques, no portraits. But for decades, that street was watched. Not by cameras, but by men who understood something the world forgot. Real power doesn't announce itself. It waits. Thomas Lucchese and Aniello Dellacroce never shook hands in any historic photograph. They didn't dine together, didn't wage wars together, didn't share headlines. And yet, their legacies whisper to each other like echoes down a marble hallway. Voices low, precise, invisible to those who speak too loudly to hear. Lucchese built Manhattan's spine, labor unions, garment industries, trucking routes, courtrooms. He dressed impeccably, spoke rarely, and knew exactly when to lean forward at the table. Dellacroce built its soul, not in business, but in ritual, not in bribes, but in belief. He was the rosary in the back pocket, the unreadable silence in the corner booth. One controlled the hand that signed, the other watched the hand that reached for the knife. What united them was discipline, not just in behavior, but in purpose. Lucchese never cared for fireworks. He believed chaos was an embarrassment. He kept his lieutenants quiet, dressed modestly, and emphasized efficiency over emotion. He once said, "It's not about how much you take, it's how much you can hold without shaking the glass." And he held it steady for over 30 years. Dellacroce, meanwhile, treated crime like a confessional. He spoke of the mafia as something ancient, almost sacred. Not a hustle, not a shortcut, but a code older than the men who served it. Silence, honor, loyalty, clean suits, clean kills, no lies, no mistakes. The world outside them was changing. In the 1950s, Lucchese quietly backed judges, union bosses, and politicians. He walked through Midtown like a banker, unseen, untouched. He didn't drink to excess, didn't flaunt mistresses. He just built, slow, calculated, until the garment district pulsed like a machine, with his signature hidden in every bolt. By the 1970s, Dellacroce was standing sentinel against a louder age. Gotti's rise, flashbulbs, the seduction of fame. Dellacroce didn't object out loud. He just watched, as if he knew that once silence is broken, control doesn't return. Neither man ever ruled officially the way others did. Lucchese was boss in title, yes, but even then, he operated more like a custodian than a king. Dellacroce was underboss, to Gambino and Castellano, but men followed him like a shadow that moved before the flame. Neither sought the spotlight, neither demanded credit, and both understood that influence wasn't declared, it was recognized. It's easy now to forget how clean their empires looked on the surface. Lucchese's control of the garment center meant millions in quiet extortion, kickbacks, and ghost payrolls. But to the world, he was Tommy Three Finger Brown, a businessman with a soft hat and a handshake you could trust. Dellacroce ran the West Side Cruise with a calm that bordered on divine. No scandals, no leaks, no names. Just rules. Enforced without passion, without explanation, and without delay. They believed the underworld should never reflect the surface world, because the surface lies, but silence tells the truth. Their deaths didn't come with violence. Lucchese passed in 1967, weakened by a brain tumor, surrounded by men who understood that the next era would not be so quiet. Dellacroce died in 1985, cancer again, refusing hospital beds, keeping his last rites between him and God. And after them, the glass began to rattle. The suits got louder, the deals got cheaper, the headlines got faster. Lucchese's successors fought over scraps. Dellacroce's disciples burned down the temple in his name, and something unspoken died with them. Not just order, but a belief. They had built something not designed to be admired, but to be obeyed. Lucchese's empire was mathematical, precise, a city of gears. Dellacroce's doctrine was spiritual, unyielding, a temple of stone. And together, though never together, they defined a kind of invisible boundary, where ambition stopped, where discipline began. Today, the silence beneath the empire has been paved over. The unions are fragmented, the crews scattered. Deals are made by men with podcasts, not pocket watches. But if you walk those same streets, early enough, quiet enough, you might still feel it. That hush before a name is spoken. That tension in a handshake. That sense that somewhere someone is still watching. Not from a throne, but from the shadows. Lucchese once said, "The game ends when someone needs to explain it." Dellacroce didn't say anything at all. He just looked at you and waited. Because in the end, the loudest men die first. But the quiet ones, they become legend.